In story we're told how our fathers of old braved the rage of the wind and the waves, and crossed o'er the deep to this desolate shore because they were loath to be slaves.
The birthright we hold shall never be sold, but sacred maintained to our graves, and before we'll comply, we'll gallantly die. For we must not, we will not be slaves. Brave boys, we must not, we will not be slaves.
Hooray for the Sons of Liberty!
Oppose the Stamp Act! This is taxation without representation! Follow the Sons of Liberty!
In the summer of 1765, this song for the Sons of Liberty could be heard all through the 13 American colonies. The Sons of Liberty were men who organized to oppose the Stamp Act, which had been passed by the British Parliament.
And before we'll comply, we'll gallantly die. For we must not, we will not be slaves. Brave boys, we must not, we will not be slaves. What was the Stamp Act? Why did the colonists feel that if they complied with it, they would become slaves?
To understand this bitter controversy, it is necessary to go back to the period following the French and Indian War. During that war, the British and the colonists, working together, had fought side by side to drive the French out of North America. But this war also had united the colonists in a common cause and given them experience in organizing themselves into groups of fighting men. And it had brought prosperity to the merchants of New England.
But the French and Indian War had left England with a large debt. Heavy taxes at home made England begin to look to its prosperous colonies for money to help the situation.
George Grenville, as the head of the British government under King George III, had the job of figuring out ways of raising money in the colonies for the British Treasury. He began by pushing through Parliament the famous Sugar Act of 1764.
The Sugar Act reduced the duty on molasses imported from the West Indies, but it placed much higher import duties on refined sugar, coffee, indigo, and other West Indian commodities. It also placed higher duties on all goods not produced in England. Grenville's plan was aimed to help the British merchant, even if it harmed the colonial prosperity.
That same year, the Currency Act was passed. This act prohibited the use in the colonies of paper money as legal currency. Since there was very little metal money, many colonists could not get enough of it to pay their debts. The Sugar Act angered the rich merchants and the ship owners. The Currency Act angered the ordinary citizen. In Boston, merchants began a boycott of British goods.
We merchants will do without English laces and ruffles.
And we workers will follow your example. We will not wear any work clothes that are not made right here in Massachusetts.
The boycott gradually spread to the other colonies, but Grenville continued his reforms. He ordered that a permanent garrison of 10,000 British soldiers be stationed in America. Although these British soldiers were sent, supposedly, to guard the colonial frontiers against Indians, actually they were stationed throughout the colonies. Under this Quartering Act, the colonists had to provide barracks and supplies for the British troops. The colonists resented the presence of the British soldiers and even more bitterly objected to housing and feeding them. They reflected their feelings in this parody.
'Twas winter and blue Tory noses were freezing
As they marched o'er the land where they ought not to be.
The Balians complained at the fifers' curse wheezing,
And wished they'd remained on the banks of the Dee, on the banks of the Dee.
Nor did Grenville intend that England pay all the other costs of maintaining these troops in America, estimated at over $1 million a year. He decided that 1/3 of this sum should be raised directly by taxing the colonies. Thus, Parliament passed the Stamp Act to become effective on November 1st, 1765.
The Stamp Act placed a tax upon newspapers, almanacs, pamphlets, legal documents of all types, ships' papers, and even playing cards. Hoping to get the colonists to cooperate, Grenville appointed Americans to collect this tax, which was then paid into the British Treasury. But cases concerning violations of the Stamp Act could be shifted from the usual colonist courts, where citizens enjoyed the right of trial by jury, to British Admiralty courts, where the verdict was given by the judge alone.
American opposition, which had been building steadily, now became unanimous. The Stamp Act affected groups which carried great weight throughout the colonies: lawyers, printers, businessmen, and shipowners. All over the country, angry mutterings could be heard.
We colonists should have a right to a trial by jury, just as have Englishmen living in England.
Yes, this is the first time Parliament has ever put a direct tax on us.
Right. It's one thing to make us pay duties on products, but this is different. If they get away with this, they'll put on more.
And this tax is against the English Constitution. They cannot tax us without our consent, and we have no representatives in Parliament. This is taxation without representation.
In the Virginia House of Burgesses, Patrick Henry introduced the Virginia Resolutions. These stated,
that the General Assembly of this colony have the only and sole exclusive right and power to lay taxes and impositions upon the inhabitants of this colony.
In a famous speech supporting these resolutions, Patrick Henry is said to have ended with these words:
Caesar had his Brutus, Charles I his Cromwell, and George III his... And George III may profit by their example. If this be treason, make the most of it!
The Virginia resolutions were discussed widely throughout the colonies. But not all the colonists simply talked about their grievances. Some formed secret organizations, like the Sons of Liberty, to oppose the Stamp Act. Often led by men of wealth and high position, these groups sometimes resorted to violence in order to force stamp agents to resign their posts and merchants to cancel orders for British goods.
Before we comply, we'll gallantly die.
For we must not, we will not be slaves.
Finally, on June 6, 1765, the Massachusetts Assembly sent a circular letter to each colony suggesting that a Congress meet in New York City in October to discuss the Stamp Act.
South Carolina, Rhode Island, Connecticut, Pennsylvania, and Maryland endorsed the proposal promptly. The assemblies of New Jersey, Delaware, and New York failed to take formal action, but were represented by delegates chosen informally. The other 4 colonies failed to act and were not represented.
On October 19, 1765, 27 delegates from 9 colonies formed the Stamp Act Congress. This was the first time so many colonies had united in a common cause. Christopher Gadsden of South Carolina expressed the new spirit of cooperation when, in a speech to the Congress, he declared,
There ought to be no New England man, no New Yorker known on the continent, but all of us Americans.
The delegates organized a colony-wide boycott of British-made goods. Then they drew up a set of 14 resolutions known as the Declaration of Rights and Grievances. The declaration was chiefly the work of John Dickinson of Pennsylvania. The close and strong ties which the colonists still felt for their mother country, England, are evident in the opening words.
The members of this Congress, with the warmest sentiments of affection and duty to His Majesty's person and government, esteem it our duty to make the following declarations of our humble opinion respecting the most essential rights and liberties of the colonists and of the grievances under which they labor by reason of several late acts of Parliament.
In the first declaration, the colonists reiterated their strong loyalty to the British government.
That His Majesty's subjects in these colonies owe the same allegiance to the Crown of Great Britain that is owing from his subjects born within the realm, and all due subordination to that august body, the Parliament of Great Britain.
The second declaration stated that the American colonists should have the same rights and privileges as those enjoyed by Englishmen born in Great Britain.
That His Majesty's subjects in these colonies are entitled to all the inherent rights and privileges of his natural-born subjects within the kingdom of Great Britain.
The third declaration asserted that one of these rights was that Englishmen could not be taxed without their consent.
That it is essential to the freedom of a people and the undoubted right of Englishmen that no taxes be imposed on them but with their own consent, given personally or by their representatives.
Declaration 4 pointed out the fact that Great Britain did not allow the colonies to be represented in the British House of Commons. Declaration 5 stated that, since the only representatives of the colonists were those chosen for their own colonial assemblies, the only taxes that could be constitutionally imposed must be levied by their own colonial legislatures. Declaration 6 declared that the British government had no right to take the colonists' property for the Crown. This referred to the Quartering Act's demands that supplies and quarters be provided by the colonists for British soldiers. The 7th Declaration stated that the colonists had a right to a trial by jury.
Trial by jury is the inherent and invaluable right of every British subject in these colonies.
Declaration 8 specifically condemned the Stamp Act for imposing taxes on the colonists and giving the Admiralty courts the authority to try the colonists without a jury.
The late Stamp Act, by imposing taxes on the inhabitants of these colonies and by extending the jurisdiction of the courts of the Admiralty beyond its ancient limits, have a manifest tendency to subvert the rights and liberties of the colonists.
Declaration 9 stated that the duties imposed by the British Parliament were so high that they would be impossible to pay.
Declarations 10 and 11 pointed out that the trade restrictions put on the colonies would actually harm Great Britain because the colonies would be unable to purchase any British goods.
Declaration 12 stressed that the colonies and Great Britain must continue to work together for their common good.
That the increase, prosperity, and happiness of these colonies depend on the full and free enjoyments of their rights and liberties, and an intercourse with Great Britain mutually affectionate and advantageous.
Declaration 13 established the right of the colonists to petition the king. The last declaration, 14, demanded that all acts depriving the colonists of their rights, such as the Stamp Act, be repealed.
Lastly, that it is the indispensable duty of these colonies to procure the repeal of the acts for applying certain stamp duties of all clauses of any other acts of Parliament whereby the jurisdiction of the Admiralty is extended, and of the other late acts for the restriction of American commerce.
The British Parliament met on January 14th to debate the Stamp Act. Grenville demanded that the army be used to enforce it.
Benjamin Franklin appeared before the British House of Commons and powerfully stated the colonial case. He warned that the use of troops to enforce the Stamp Act might bring on rebellion. He called for outright repeal.
In addition to this bitter colonial opposition, the British Parliament was being pressured by British merchants who had been hurt by the American boycott of their goods. There was nothing for the British government to do but to back down. In March 1766, Parliament repealed the Stamp Act and revised the Sugar Act downward. America received the news with rejoicing. John Adams wrote that the decision of the British government to abandon the Stamp Act
hushed into silence almost every popular clamor and composed every wave of popular disorder into a smooth and peaceful calm.
The boycott of British goods was immediately lifted. The colonists everywhere expressed gratitude and loyalty toward their mother country.
God save our gracious King, long live our noble King, God save the King. Send him victorious, happy and glorious, long to reign over us. God save the King.
But Parliament had bowed to pressures. it really had not accepted the American arguments as presented in the resolutions drawn up by the Stamp Act Congress. This was made clear by a declaratory act passed by Parliament, which stated that the King and Parliament had full power and authority to make laws binding the American colonists in all cases whatsoever.
This gesture of retaliation was hardly noticed at the time, but it foreshadowed events which finally exploded into war between England and the American colonies, the Revolutionary War. The Stamp Act Congress brought the colonies together and united them in a common cause. It set the pattern which the colonies were to follow in taking future action against their mother country. It showed them that in union there is strength.
Born from a world of tyrants beneath the western sky, we'll form a new dominion, a land of liberty. The world shall own, we're masters here, then hasten on the day. Oppose, oppose, oppose for North America.